to our literacy study committee. It's just a pleasure to have you all on here. I will do a quick check-in of our other board members on the committee. Just if you would state your name for the record that you're on here, and then we'll review our agenda and we'll get going.
Daryl Cobbins is present.
Well, I'll go ahead and say my name, Lillian Hartgrove. I'm not an official member of the study committee. However, this subject matter is near and dear to my heart, so I definitely wanted to join you all today. Thank you.
Great to have you, Lillian.
Warren Wells, State Board.
Great. All right. So we do, just to go over, this is a quorum, and so we can officially start that. Trying to get my formal language down here, but just wanted to go through our agenda today. And really, we wanted to start with best practices in literacy. I'll get to that to introduce our guests. We want to look back at, we had a great report at one of our quarterly board meetings on student retention data. Wanted to bring them back and kind of dive into that. So it's part 2. The sequel is always better than the first one, I'm sure. We are going to look at our universal reading screener from the winter data report, look at the literacy landscape, and then anything we want to talk about in that. So we'll go ahead and start with this idea of best practices. And so when we were beginning this study committee, one thing we wanted to do and we discussed was who's already doing a great job, like who's already doing what, and how do we collaborate with each other? How do we share best practices? Instead of us, sitting in a room and trying to figure out what's going on, why don't we start with what is going on in real time and has been going on? And so want to make sure we start all of our study committees with some sort of educational component about what is going on in the state of Tennessee and what's going on inside the walls of our schools. And I was fortunate enough to be on a tour to CMCSS with our ERIC Commission a month or so ago, and had the extreme pleasure and to get to meet Emily Vaughn. And so as we were discussing and talking through sort of the landscape of education in the state and everything that entails, I thought, man, she would be really good. This group would be really good. Her and Ashley would be really, really good to come and share with us what they're doing, an hour from here. And I guess from here where I am, so an hour from Nashville. If you're not in Nashville, then it's further away probably. So it is a pleasure to have Emily Vaughn and Ashley Forbes from Clarksville, Montgomery County School System, and to share with us their literacy journey to begin this, for us, an educational component of what is working and going well and what are some of the best practices in our state. So thank you very, very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you both with us, and I will turn it over to you. And when they get done, we'll then have some time for questions from other members of the committee.
Thank you so much, Nate, for that kind welcome, and we're excited to be with all of you today. It's an honor to be here with you all, and that Ashley could join me. She certainly has been a great leader in this work. I serve in CMCSS as the Director of Teaching and Learning, and so I have been working in literacy for quite a long time. Served as when we first had Read to Be Ready coaches, and we first started our early learning walk a long time ago, all the way up to where we are now. So we're going to take you through a little bit of that journey and where we are, and excited to share that with you. So all of our work is grounded in our district strategic work process. And so that has changed over time, as you can imagine, but where we sit now, it's to be implementing research-based literacy practices to develop competent readers, writers, and thinkers. And so I think you'll see that theme throughout our work in our district. So our journey here started, as you can imagine, with high quality instructional materials. You know that was a big step for all of us as we really made that shift. And you'll see that as being kind of a theme for us in our work. Through that, we really were getting a great big push there and thinking about moving towards the adoption of materials, and then COVID hit, right? And so we were just on the cusp of starting to develop our literacy vision in the process of adopting those materials. And so kind of our vision took a back seat for a brief moment as we began to think about what opening schools during that time looked like. And so as we returned and got back on focus, we began to ground everything in the TNTP report for the opportunity myth, and really focused on those 4 key resources. And that led us through refining our literacy vision. And that vision really was grounded in the instructional shifts as well as the core actions. And you'll see it here. We wanted our vision of literacy is for all of our students to be readers, writers, and thinkers who utilize text and task to deepen knowledge, think critically, solve problems, and generate new ideas about the world around them. And we thought if that could be what our students do, and that's what our teachers were preparing them to do, then all of our students would be ready for whatever the world had for them when they exited our schools. So we continued through February of 2021, connecting that work, continued that process, really staying grounded in that work, really thinking through those core actions. And that led us all the way through this year. And our spring this year really has been really focused on using the IPG as a walkthrough tool, focusing on that qualitative data piece, as we also focused on what our quantitative data was sharing with us. So our journey has been one grounded in making sure teachers had the right materials, making sure we're training them on how to implement and use those materials effectively, and then how to monitor that process. So as we began to really look at the data to say, are those things that we're working and implementing working? And how can we continue to support those processes? We really have been looking at 2 pieces of data along the way. We have a quantitative piece. We have a benchmark that we use that we give 3 times a year, in addition to our universal screener. So of course we do universal screeners, and we do our data chats around those screeners and serve students who need intervention for that. But we also do a standards-based benchmark that helps us to see where we are with standards. And then we use a qualitative piece of data using the walkthrough tool, the IPG. And so I'll share a little bit of that with you all. And so we know that the data does tell a story. And before we really know what that story is, we have to figure out like what the end data says, right? So going back to that TCAP data, we know where we were in 1819. And so that blue data looked pretty good. We were making gains. At that point, 43% of our schools were reward schools. And so we had the most reward schools in our area. And so very proud of that fact. And then of course, no assessment in 1920. And then as you could imagine, we took that hit in 2021. And so we know that we had to really focus and make sure that we were meeting all the needs of our students so that we could recover and make sure we were meeting their needs across all spectrums. So that's really where that quantitative data has helped us to take a look at that. So we've been using this benchmark data. We use a case assessment if you're familiar with that one. And so that helps us monitor our projected percent proficient. And so this particular data was from the second administration. The blue line demonstrates our first administration of the assessment that took place in October. The second one, which was a December and January administration. And so since this point, we've taken our last one. And so I will share with you that my most interesting thought behind this is the comparison of where were we in that blue year, right? The year where we were doing really well pre-COVID. And so on this slide, what the red overlay represents is our previous TCAP scores, right? So where we were when we kind of took that dip in testing. So any green you see is recovery growth. So that's really exciting. So, and that's just from the second administration. So if I was to put the third administration of the assessment on here, and that's what we'll be working on now to see kind of where we are now. So I'm happy to see any green, because green for me is recovery, and that's looking exciting for us. So, and let's see here, when I look at this, I'm anxious to see our case benchmark data for English 2. I want to know what that recovery looks like, because we haven't quite made it there yet. But very excited to see that what we're putting in place in our classrooms and our professional learning is really making a difference. So let's talk about what that looks like. What are we doing in those classrooms? So we do dig down deeper. It's not just about proficiency. We look at our strand data. We want to know in every strand what that information looks like for our students. As you can imagine, conventions are high. Teachers like to teach conventions, right? That's a little bit straightforward to teach. Vocabulary too. Do love a good vocabulary lesson, but we do want to make sure that we are integrating those standards. We know that's what the shifts call for and what the core actions call for. Data tells one piece, right? But the data is not just quantitative. We have to have that instructional piece too. And I can't tell you how much we have learned from the literacy walks, and not just instructionally, but professionally, how much we've learned. This has been probably the biggest stretch for our administrators as well, to get in and think and look at learning and instruction this way, because it's a lot different than just looking at a number. So when you look across all levels at our core actions, the data that we're receiving from our learning walks, core action looks core action 1 looks pretty great. But why is that? It goes back to those high quality instructional materials, right? We've been afforded the opportunity to have great materials for the first time in a very long time. So that should be there for us. So hopefully that's going to look good and even better, because we know that core action 1 is grounded in those high quality materials. Core action 2 looks a little bit different. You know that this is heavily back onto a teacher and the collaborative planning that takes place, the understanding, and the delivery of a lesson, the development of questions and tasks, which is more difficult, right? So that is definitely a learning area for us, and where we spend a lot of time in professional learning. And Ashley can share what we're doing there as we talk about the impact of the Success Act. And so this is exciting data to track, though, because you'll see for every level, it looks a bit different, because at each level, we're at a different part of professional learning. Middle school has been at this a little bit longer and has had some different levels of support, and their data is shaping up a little bit different than elementary and high school. And so as we continue to extract this data and share this data, we'll know exactly how to support them in their professional learning. And then core action 3, I think about this document, obviously it's pretty linear. So if you can't get 1, you don't go to 2. And if you can't get 2, you don't go to 3. So a lot of times we're just not ready for core action 3, because if you don't have high quality text and the right questions and tasks, the engagement in those things don't necessarily matter as much. And so 3 is something that really will be our focus as we move into next year, as we get core action 2 really solid in our schools. So we know strategy matters, because strategy equals outcomes. And I mentioned earlier the work that we have been grounded in TNTP's work and research, and the 4 key resources really do ground a lot of our work. But the vision that we have, and knowing that that vision is based on the shifts in the core actions, and really that coupled with the high quality instructional materials, have been where we have spent our time and our focus. And so Ashley's going to share with you a really interesting piece of data and some work that we've done that will show you some of the impact that's taken place, really that started in 1819 through now.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about, this was in 1819. So we saw a need in foundational literacy skills. So this was even pre-Literacy Success Act. And so in one school building, we piloted a high quality instructional materials that was a systematic, explicit foundational skills instruction. And so the 4 schools that you'll see here, by the end of that school year in 19, their universal screening data, we compared the pilot school to 3 other schools that were very similar in demographics to that school. And so after a year of explicit systematic instruction with high quality materials, the pilot school only had 8% of their students in kindergarten below the 25th, 12% in first grade, and 9% below the 25th. And so you'll see the difference in comparison to when that high quality instructional materials were implemented with fidelity, the difference in the data between those schools. So that was one of the things that we did, that, and we've continued to use that in our K2 as a tier 1 instructional materials for foundational skills. So the next data that you'll see is those same students that we were just looking at that were sitting in kindergarten in 18-19 are now in 3rd grade, but you'll see their data from kindergarten, 1st and 3rd grade. So they're sitting in 3rd grade right now. And so those same students on their universal screener for the CBM reading data, the oral reading fluency, 84% of those students were above the 30th percentile in our spring screener that we just did. And so it just goes to show when you implement those materials in the kindergarten first and they are implemented with fidelity, that those students retain those foundational skills and then they're able to apply them once they've moved to 3rd grade in a connected text. So that's pretty exciting and pretty powerful. And we're continuing to work to build that capacity among all of our school buildings with those materials as well. So another thing that we've done in response to the Literacy Success Act is we have partnered with the American Institutes for Research, and we have a grant in our 1st and 2nd grade, and we have 2 arms of the grant. We have one side that is working with CORE and one that is working with ECRI, and it's specifically in 1st and 2nd grade, but we have coaches that are connected to that work, and they are supporting those teachers and implementing those high quality instructional materials with their tier 1. So in connection to tier 2, tier 3, and tier 1. So really, that's been a great, we just started that this school year, and that's a 3-year grant. So it'll continue for 2 years to build capacity in those 1st and 2nd grade classrooms. And so then something else we're doing, we really have seen a need in the content knowledge for teachers to really understand how we learn to read and how to take that research into the classroom. And so once we saw that need, we've worked out a plan as how do we get this information to teachers. And so in spring of 2020, we had a group from our district leaders take a class in the science of reading together, and it was based in the Teaching Reading Resource Book with CORE. And then last summer, we had over 200 of our teachers attend the 360 training. And then we also know that there's a huge need for upper elementary and secondary teachers as well to have this knowledge. It's not just our kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade teachers that need that knowledge. And so we've had district-led professional development in the science of reading. And this year it's been mainly for our teacher leaders. So our academic coaches that are in our buildings, in our elementary and our middle, as well as our 3-5 lead teachers. We have one of those in every building. So they have been this past year gone through, it's not a program, it's the knowledge of how we learn to read and then how to implement that. And so moving forward, in the summer of 2022, we're hosting 3 secondary cohorts for the 360. So we're hosting that here in our district for those secondary teachers to attend that training. But then we're also super excited about, we have what's called a Summer Literacy Institute. And so this is going to be where we have a K2 group and we have a 3-5 group. And so they're going to be led through basically learning and then applying. So they're going to follow an exemplar teacher and be able to take information about screening data and diagnostic data. And then how do I apply that in my instruction and differentiate for the different readers that are in my classroom? So that's this summer in June that we're super excited about. And then continuing to see the need, a couple more things. We are partnering with Austin Peay because we are collaborating, because it's not just the teachers that are in our district currently, it's the teachers that are coming to us that are that we want to make sure that they have that content knowledge, and what's those 6 standards that are put forth that they need to implement in those EPPs are so connected to the Foundational Literacy Act and the expectations of what we want teachers to know about dyslexia, how to address those foundational skills, and what are those 5 components of reading, and how is that implemented in the classroom. So we're working with Austin Peay to support them for our teachers that are then going to be coming to us and teaching in our districts, to make sure that we have very close alignment to what they're learning in their educator prep programs and then coming to the classroom. And then we're continuing to open up that Science of Reading course this coming year to any K-12 teacher that wants to build their knowledge about the science of reading, because I want all teachers to have that knowledge. And so it's going to be an ongoing PLC throughout the school year where we have, there's 4 in the fall and 4 in the spring, but it's very much we meet and learn, and then there's a task of applying in your classroom and then coming back together and let's talk about what worked, what didn't, so that way they can truly apply the content they're learning to the teachers or to the students that they're working with.
And I think with everything going on in education right now, and all the demands of teachers, it's really important at the district level for us to keep saying, if the work doesn't align with this vision, then we're not doing it. So if things are coming at us or demands are coming at us and we can't make it fit here, which we know is the right work, then we're finding another way to do it, or finding some other way to incorporate it where this can still be our main focus. So that is kind of what our journey has been. It's not been a straight road at all. It's definitely been a pretty curvy road, and it certainly has had a lot of speed bumps along the way, but we're getting there. We're seeing some good data along the way, and certainly proud of the work that we've done, knowing that we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. And tomorrow, Emily and I are going to actually go, because we want to continue our work with the EPPs. We're going to go visit a school in East Tennessee that is doing work with UTK. And we want to get some ideas from them into how are they making those connections from the EPP to the school district. So we're going to be able to do that.
This is Sarah. I just put in the chat, but thank you so much for, I mean, to me, it's really compelling at every level, but I love hearing the EPP connections too, because I do think you're so smart to work closely with Austin P to ensure that your future teachers are also benefiting from this great work and come in ready to hit the ground running with you all. So I know Nate was energized by his visit, as he said, and I think this was a perfect way to start this meeting. Good thinking, Chair.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And obviously, I just want to congratulate you on the way that you have, I think, took reality as it is, not as you want it to be, and notice where we were before COVID hit and where it is when it did and where we want to go. And I think that's been hard for all of us because, there's been learning loss, but just the way that you presented that was such an optimistic and intentional view of, yes, here we are, how are we going to improve? And we're going to be crystal around this vision, and anything outside of that is just a distraction. And so well done. And thank you so much for sharing. I do want to open up then just, do any of our other board members or guests have any questions for our team from Clarksville?
This is Lillian. I do want to add another piece that I thought was important that you shared in the end. I think it was you, Ashley, the fact that you are visiting UTK and you're going to learn from them and sharing of best practices. I love that you are doing that, and all the other work that has already been mentioned here. The one question that I have, and I may have read between the lines where maybe perhaps I should not have, are all of your teachers who are K-12, I'm sorry, K-2, going through all the instructional learnings that you're offering in the summer, the PLCs and all those opportunities, are they seizing those opportunities, and are you requiring them, or is it optional that they go through the various trainings that you're offering?
Yeah, so I'd say all of the above. So we do have 2 separate weeks of a conference, our local conference here, which is called Engage. And that particular opportunity is open for all teachers. That is one way they get their professional learning hours. There are a lot of courses in that particular conference embedded here. And you'll see those courses all filled with teachers. They're packed every year. This particular Summer Institute course is a little more limited to capacity. There are 30 teachers in the K-2 course and 30 teachers in the 3-5 course. Those teachers are actually getting a stipend to attend because it is a week-long professional learning course. and followed by a year-long PLC. So it's a pretty heavy lift for those teachers. And we've been very specific with principals about who would be the right teacher to send to that course. I use myself as an example. I say, you know, I want you to look for Emily Vaughn, who came out of college without any kind of formal training in letters and sounds and was tasked to teach first grade reading. And, you know, she really tried hard, but bless those babies' hearts in those first couple of years that she taught, because they didn't get the best reading training. But then she learned, and there were, you know, she received some really good training, and then she was a great reading teacher. Like, that's who you're looking for. And so they're looking for those teachers who are hungry for the learning, because it's going to be really heavy. And so if we can figure out how to do that right and replicate that and build upon that, that's going to be fantastic. Now, the class that Ashley is going to offer after that, that's open to everyone, you'll see pretty heavy attendance there as well. So we're trying to tag in lots of different ways people who want different opportunities in ways that are convenient for them. So maybe I can't take a full week-long course, but I can commit to 8 one-hour PLCs across the school year, or I can commit to a book study in this way. So we're trying to find all the different pockets that we can to get the learning to the teachers. And also, we have a whole new cycle of lead teachers coming in next year that will receive that training. So we're really trying to grab every audience that we can, as in many different ways that we can. But teachers are hungry for it.
Yeah, that's what I.
That's great. I love hearing that. And then the one follow-up question is, do you have any resistance from any teachers who perhaps really need that training, but you have to coax them into it, or you have to require them to do it?
Of course.
I would imagine that you do, because I've heard it from other
Of course.
districts, and so I figured that you did too. You would not necessarily.
Yeah.
Exception.
Yeah, of course. There's always resistance. And I think that's twofold. I think you have resistance from teachers who have seen success. And you can get that in a lot of different ways. You have teachers who've seen success because they teach the screener, right? So that my students perform well in a screener, but students can't do a crossover of that skill. And so that's really misguided success. You see teachers who sometimes experience success because they have students who are going to succeed sometimes even without a teacher. And that's a strange way of putting that. But there are some students who are in some populations who are going to do well because they are afforded different experiences and are just predispositioned to do so. And so sometimes you have to really get to the heart of, and data will usually help us do that, get to the heart of what is the purpose, what is that student doing, and what could they be doing, and really digging into your data. And that's why I think using both the quantitative and qualitative helps us do that, because you're seeing both sides. You're seeing a data piece for the student and a data piece for the instructional practices of the teacher. And one or both of those usually do help tell the full story.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you again for the presentation.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments for our two panelists?
I know I'm not part of the state board, but I just really want to give a huge shout out to Clarksville Montgomery, because it is an amazing partnership of some of the state resources and some of the great work that you are leading, and very excited to hear that in my day. And I just had to shout them out at least once.
Hey, Lisa, how are you?
Good. I'm sure I will be Twitterifying this experience tonight, but I just want to give you a personal shout out.
Thank you. We always appreciate your support.
Great. Other questions? So I just want to thank you. And I want to say just something for the record. When I was out there, we were talking to a number of student panelists. And one of the questions that came up from the Area Commission was just about COVID and how to get back and what was that like and what was online learning like. And I just want to say, one of the students was very vulnerable and talked about the struggles the student had during COVID, how low it took them, how apathetic it had kind of he just couldn't get it going. And how a teacher in their school system sort of got him, sought him out, and spoke life into him, so much so that when he was giving us a tour, he wanted us to go in that classroom and show us all about the class. And it was just neat to see, uh, a high school age student talking through their struggles and then being able to directly point to a teacher in this district and say, I'm in a really good place. I'm excited for what's next, and I have to give thanks to this teacher. And so, um, data is amazing. This plan is amazing, but I just want to affirm them too that from a face-to-face with student and teacher in my interaction, it just aligns with everything they've talked about, which is people who care and want to see kids grow and learn. So thank you very much. It is great to have you on here. And we will now move on. So thanks so much.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you.
So next up, I guess I'll keep us going here. We're a few minutes behind on our agenda. I apologize, Daphne, or Allie. Um, yes, part two. So A New Hope was a great movie, but Empire Strikes Back was even better. So sometimes the sequel is better than the original. And so it's a pleasure to have Dr. Susan Patrick and Caitlin Elgart. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, with us to share what the Tennessee Education Research Alliance is doing and how they are looking at early literacy and grade retention throughout Tennessee. They met with our full board at our last full meeting, and it was just phenomenal data. And so we wanted them to come back and share with this committee a lot of what they're learning as they've studied this across the state. So I would thank you for being with us. We're very, very glad to have you present, and just going to turn it over to you guys.
All right, thanks so much. We're really happy to be back, and you'll see that we're going to start with presenting a few of the things we talked about in February
okay.
as a little bit of a refresher, because it feels like a year ago to me, and probably to many of you as well. And then we have some new analysis that we're going to dig into. So again, thank you so much for having us. I'll briefly introduce myself, and so will Caitlin before we jump in. So I am Susan Patrick. I am currently at the Learning Policy Institute, but for many years was at the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, and actually started this project with the state board back in, 2015, a long time ago. So it's fun to kind of been able to follow it over time, and now be kind of finalizing the analysis now. And I'll just turn it briefly over to Caitlin to introduce herself as well.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin Elgart. I'm a PhD student in economics at Vanderbilt University, and I joined Susan on this project back in the fall. So looking forward to sharing what we've been working on with you all.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. So this was exactly the same way that we started the February presentation, but this is just as like a refresher reminder for everyone. I know this is probably top of mind because you've been thinking about it from the policy angle. But our interest is in early grades retention, so students who are held back in kindergarten through third grade. And there has been a good amount of legislative and policy action around third grade retention in particular. So just to kind of set the scene here before we dig into the data. So as you all know, in 2011, there was the first third grade retention law. There was a slight update to that law in 2012, which is why both years are listed there. But the way that the law in 2011 was written was that third grade students should not be promoted to fourth grade without a basic understanding and skills in reading. But the way the law was written gave a lot of flexibility to districts, and districts were allowed to choose any research-based intervention that students could get instead of being retained in the third grade. The law also specifically called out students with IEPs as not being kind of part of the way the law was written, and there was exceptions for those students. As you all know, you updated your promotion and retention policies. Those went into effect in 2018. And that had taken, I think, pretty old promotion and retention policies and made them much more specific
And so just a few things to note here, just because they come up in the analysis that we did of retention rates, is that in the state board policies, you specifically call out that retention decisions should not be made based on whether a student has an IEP, their English learner status, or their maturity level. And then again, as I know we all know, during the special session last year, there was an update to the third grade retention law that passed in the legislature, which took the 2011 law, but actually made it much more specific in terms of both how you define proficiency, but also particular interventions that may happen either in addition to or instead of retention. And that law does call out a couple of exemptions, specifically for English learners who are in the first 2 years of English instruction and students who are previously retained. I just mentioned the previous retained part just because that is something we'll look at a little bit today, is looking at patterns of students who are retained and when they're retained during their journey from kindergarten to third grade. So I just want to set the scene a little bit with some prior research on retention in other states. And so, a lot of the broad research on retention that's been done over the last, half of a century would suggest that retention on average has either negative effects or no effects on student outcomes, things like students' grades, their likelihood of dropping out of high school, how they engage in school in the future. However, in the last 2 decades or so, a number of states and large districts have been engaging in kind of much more specific retention policies. So Florida's third grade retention law is probably the most well-known of these, but a lot of these policies, the way they work is they have kind of very defined criteria of who is going to be retained, and they often have very particular requirements of interventions that happen alongside retention or sometimes in lieu of retention. And so the important thing that's come out of the research of all these different new policies is that kind of 2 things are going on. One, there's a lot of research to suggest that these interventions that might go alongside of retention do have positive impacts on students. And so a lot of the more recent research that looks at retention would suggest that, when retention is coupled with interventions, often there are at least short-term positive impacts on students. But also that it really matters how you study the effects of retention. And so this can get really tricky. If you think about it, there's lots of different reasons why students are retained. And a lot of those underlying reasons for retention are things that might affect students throughout the rest of their trajectory through the rest of school. And so often it's really hard to disentangle, what are the underlying reasons why students are retained and what are the effects of retention. And so there's been a lot of different ways that recently researchers have been trying to disentangle this. And so in our analysis today, what I'll kind of foreground in saying is that we're not going to be able to look at the effect of retention, but what we are going to be looking at is the effect of the retention law change that happened in 2011. And so we'll be talking about some of the effects of that on students who are targeted by that law. So that actually gets me into kind of our guiding questions. And so when we all met in February, we went over the results from the first 2 research questions. I will provide like a couple of slides on those. There are some much more detailed slides, I think, in the version of the slides that got sent out to the board members themselves. So you have all of those additional analyses that we went over in February. We're going to mostly focus on the 3rd research question today, which, as I mentioned, is kind of what is the effect of this 2011 retention law on the students who are targeted by the law, which are students who are not proficient in reading at the end of 3rd grade. We'll talk a little bit about this final question, which is what we're working on now, and what will be included in kind of a final summary memo that we'll be providing to the board in June. So just a little bit about how we're thinking about and defining retention, because it is particular and it's important to know before we look at some of these retention rates and statewide patterns in retention. So we're using the Tennessee Student Data System, EIS, and we're able to look at kind of how students are tagged in the system in every year they're in school, so we can follow students over time. And so we're looking specifically at this set of years starting in the 2009-10 school year through the end of last school year, and particularly looking in kindergarten through 3rd grade. We are counting a student as retained if they spent 2 full years in the same grade. So when we look at retention rates, that's what we mean by retained. And so I mentioned, you know, these historical patterns and trends in retention, as well as differences across groups. I'm only going to show a few of these slides because, again, these are slides that we went into detail to talk about at the February meeting. So this is a slide you've seen before, but I'm just going to talk you through it because it kind of sets the scene for the analysis that Caitlin is going to go into. So, you know, this is showing the overall retention rates by grade. So the green line at the top is kindergarten, and then it shows first grade, second grade, and third grade. There's a few things that I want to draw your attention to here. Across all 4 early elementary grades, retention rates have been trending downwards, and they've been trending downwards for the last 5 to 6 years. There was a big drop in 2020, which would be the first pandemic year. And so we largely think that's probably due to changes that schools made about retention decisions because of the pandemic. But you can also see the differences right after these 2 different changes that have happened already. So the 3rd grade retention law went into effect for the 2011-12 school year. And so right after that red line is the first year after that. And certainly, as you can see here, there wasn't a big uptick in 3rd grade retention. Caitlin's going to talk about that more when we talk about the effect of that law change. And then, as you can see, kind of both before and after the new state board policies, retention rates had been trending down before those went into effect, and they've continued to trend down in the couple of years since then. Just to give you a sense of scale, like how many kids are actually getting retained across the state. So in 2014, which is across this period, kind of one of the higher years in terms of retention rates. I mean, they're all pretty similar, but they're a little bit higher in 2014. So in 2014, there were about 300,000 kindergarten through 3rd grade students across the state. Of those 300,000, about 9,000 of those students were retained in the 2014-15 school year. And then finally, just want to make the point that, you know, when we talk about the 3rd grade retention law and the updated law, you know, that this is actually something that's targeting a large number of students. You know, I know this is something this committee is very interested in and very aware of. But, you know, since 2010, more than half of 3rd graders who are testing in either the TCAP or 10 Ready test are performing below proficient on the state's 3rd grade reading assessment. And so what that means in our analysis is that the students who are targeted by these 3rd grade retention laws are actually a very large percentage of the student population. And then we went into great detail about how this varied across student groups in the February meeting. I just want to highlight one here, and then we're going to go through another couple set of examples about what this looks like in practice across time. But just one, I think, to point out here, just because this is one that's mentioned in both the 2011 retention law and the state board policies, is that students who are identified as having a disability are about twice as likely to be retained in kindergarten through 3rd grade as students who are not identified as having a disability. And this does vary quite a bit by specific disability types. And so in the supplementary slides, we do break this down by discipline or by a disability type. And so you're able to see it there. But just wanted to point this out because this is something that's written into policy. And so I think it's just something to be thinking about, kind of how to make meaning of these big differences across certain student groups. And then finally, I'm going to walk you through this slide because this slide kind of talks about how these differences across student groups really compound over time. So I'm just going to kind of talk you through the bars in this slide. So the very top bar is all 3rd grade students who are proficient in TCAP or 10 Ready in their 3rd grade year. And so kind of the gray bar is showing what percentage of those students had been retained before they got to 3rd grade, and then what percentage are retained in 3rd grade. And so you can see that these students, only a very small percentage of them had been previously retained, and then less than 0.1% of them are retained in 3rd grade. So these are students that rarely have experienced retention. The next bar is for all 3rd grade students who were not proficient on their 3rd grade, either TCAP or 10 Ready test. And so as you can see, those students are about 3 times as likely to have already been retained by the time they get to 3rd grade. And then obviously far more likely to be retained in third grade, even though the percentage is still very small in third grade. And so, as you can see, about 13% of those students across these years that we're looking at have been previously retained, and then a little over 1% are retained in third grade. Then you can start breaking that down by different student groups. And so a lot of past research on retention suggests that boys are more likely to be retained than girls. That is something that we see in Tennessee, especially in kind of retention prior to third grade. You can see those differences there. And then you see the same pattern for economically disadvantaged students. Again, this is very aligned with national patterns, where students who are identified as economically disadvantaged are more likely to have experienced retention. And this is true both kids like experience retention before they get to third grade and then in third grade. Then you can see the student with disabilities difference here, which is pretty striking. So if you're a student who's been identified by the third grade as having a disability and you are scoring below proficient on the third grade reading TCAP or 10 ready, about 25% of those students have already been retained by the time they get to third grade. And that's compared to about 11% of students without disabilities. Even though you can look at those third grade retention rates, they're actually very, very similar for students with and without disabilities. And so really the difference is based on kind of who's being retained in the earlier grades. And then finally, these things, overlap. Students don't belong to just one category often. And so you can start to see how, different students are having very different experiences, are much more or much less likely to have experienced retention, before they get to third grade and then in third grade. All right, and then the final point we want to make before we're going to take a little break here for questions, and then we'll get into the effects of the law change. So the one last point we want to make, and we did this in a couple of different ways in the February meeting, is that retention rates do vary across schools and across districts. And so, this is showing the retention rates at the school level. And it's showing the retention rates at the school level just for third grade students who are performing not proficient in reading. And so what we're doing here is we're showing what do those school retention rates for third graders look like right before that third grade retention law change. And then what do they look like the year right after the law change, the first year the law is in effect. And so on the left side of the screen, what this is showing is that really tall bar is showing that 74% of all the schools across the state retained no third grade students who were scoring below proficient on their third grade reading TCAP in 2011. And then on average, schools were retaining about 1% of those students. But you can see, and this is in this kind of oval at the bottom, that there are schools that are retaining higher percentages than that. So there are some schools that are retaining 5, 10, 15% of their third grade students who are scoring below proficient. On the right side, it's showing the exact same thing, but for 1 year later. So this is the first year the third grade retention law is implemented. And the patterns are not strikingly different, but you do see a bit of an uptick when it comes to retention of third grade students who are not proficient in reading. So 64, so almost 2/3 of schools still are not retaining any third grade students. And the average retention rate has bumped up a little bit. And so as Caitlin will get into when she starts talking, I think the point we want to make here is that retention rates do vary across schools, but there certainly isn't a lot of strong evidence that after the law change that schools are doing something completely different when it comes to retention. And so, what we are imagining is that there may have been some changes in the years since the law has changed around interventions. And so we are particularly kind of interested in thinking about, what could be happening when it comes to interventions. I want to pause there just to see if there are any questions before we get into the analysis about the effect of the law change.
Do we have any questions by anyone? I have one, if no one else does. Just out of curiosity, for the students, do we have information on after the student's been retained, how they do the next year? So if it's their second time in third grade, did that all of a sudden magically bump them up to proficient, or was it still more the same? Because historically, I think it's been retention really is not an effective strategy, and yet there's this commitment to it in some places. And so I was just curious if there's any evidence after someone has been retained, was there a change?
Mm-hmm. So that's what we'll be sharing with the fourth research question in the final memo. But
Right,
that's
sorry,
exactly what we're going to be looking at is
Okay.
just like, do you see kind of some changes for students who experience retention? So yeah, that will definitely be included in the final memo. Part of what Caitlin's about to present is going to talk more about kind of the effect of being targeted by this law, which might mean for some kids it means they're retained, but for a lot of kids it might mean they're just getting some sort of additional intervention. But yes, we are very, we definitely will be sharing kind of what does it look like, what are the outcomes, both the immediate, outcomes that are happening right after, but then those outcomes over time, because we have enough, years of, time has passed since this law changed, and so we can look at high school outcomes,
Right.
even for retained students in the early parts of the data that we have here.
There's a question on here from Jack Powers that he wrote in the chat, and I don't know when this fits in, but did the studies summarized in the literature review tend to focus on a specific grade band of students, or were the studies more focused on retention broadly?
Yeah, it depends. It's a great question, Jack. And actually, there's like kind of two different types of studies that tend to happen with retention. And so one of them are of specific retention policies. So similar to what Caitlin's about to present. And so those usually are targeted at very specific grades. So, like a lot of states have latched on to the third grade kind of idea. And so there are a number of studies that focus specifically on third grade retention. There are other districts where that's at a different point, fourth grade, eighth grade, different parts. There are other studies that are more descriptive, where they're actually just doing kind of like what Nate just described, where they're just looking at over time, can we compare students who are retained to similar students who weren't retained and see what happens? And those tend to be broader, where they look at retention across a broader set of grades.
Yeah, great. That's super helpful just for clarity there. This is super, super interesting. And just, I guess the one comment I have is just, I think this is super helpful for framing in terms of teeing up the specific requirements in the new retention law. Reflecting back on your first slide, looking at what the 2011 law specified, kind of the flexibility at the district level there, maybe the lack of like a common uniform metric to say you are identified as needing retention, coupled with, very intentional research-based interventions, I think is a really important kind of difference to highlight, in a way that this new law is very different from kind of the 2011 law, and hopefully in a way that'll years down the road really show up when we start looking at the student data.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's striking. I mean, it's very different the way that it's written. And it is more similar, the new law is more similar to what a number of other states have been implementing. And so there's definitely a lot of research that now exists out there to look at kind of how that's played out in other states as well. All right, well, I want to move us on, if it's okay with everyone, so that we can get into that main question that we want to talk about today, because I think this will be of particular interest. And just before I pass it over to Caitlin, I think one thing that she will emphasize over and over again, but I'm going to also emphasize right now, is that, up until this point in the presentation, we've been talking about retention, actually, like who's getting retained, what are the retention rates. Now we are shifting gears, and we're going to be talking about the effects of the retention law change. So it's not the effects of retention itself, but the effects of the law change with the 2011 retention law. All right, let me pass it over to Caitlin.
Great, thanks for teeing that up, Susan. So we're moving into our next research question that's, like Susan said, looking at what is the effect of this 2011 Tennessee retention law on the subsequent schooling outcomes for these students that are not proficient on their third grade reading scores and are therefore targeted by this law. And so there's two ways that students can be impacted by this particular law change. They can either be retained for another third grade year due to their lack of proficiency in reading, or they can be provided with an additional research-based intervention. And so first, zooming in on some of these retention patterns for these third grade students that are not proficient on their reading scores. We can see that retention rates for students that are not proficient in reading versus those that are proficient in reading are very different, in that third grade students that are not proficient are more likely than those who are to be retained, but are still retained at very low rates across the board, hovering between 1% and 2% of students that are being retained. We do see that this upticks in the wake of the third grade retention law, but not dramatically so. And so we can assume that the students that are being targeted by this law are either receiving this additional retention, but more likely being provided with these additional research-based interventions in the wake of this policy change. And so, unfortunately, we're not able to directly measure or observe what research-based interventions these students are receiving and when at the student level. But what we do have is a 2015 district survey that suggests that some of these districts do have written policy to provide these additional research-based interventions to these particular students that are at risk of retention. And so what we see is that approximately half of districts specifically mention these additional academic interventions when asked about their third grade retention policy. 15 of them specifically mention RTI, and 20 districts indicated that they offer summer school for these students that are at risk of retention. And so when we're thinking about the effect of this law change as a whole, we can think that these students are either being impacted by a higher likelihood of being retained or a higher likelihood of being provided one of these research-based interventions to help them catch back up to their peers. And we can think of these results that we'll go through as moving through both of these channels that we've just outlined. And so when we're thinking about which students we're analyzing, our sample includes about 350,000 students statewide. We're zooming into students who were in third grade between 2010 and 2014, and we exclude any students that did not participate in their reading assessments at the end of third grade. And so we'll talk as well about differences in these effects for students based on their various student characteristics, and we include some of these characteristics in our model. And those student characteristics are all measured as of the student's first year in third grade. So while some of these characteristics can change over time, for example, economically disadvantaged status can change over time for a student, we'll be measuring those characteristics in this analysis as of the student's year that they were in third grade. And so there are a number of different ways that we can look at the cause and effect of a law change on the students that are targeted by this law. We are going to be using a difference in differences model, which essentially allows you to compare two different groups, one of which was not impacted by the law and one of which was impacted by the law, to look at the overall effect of the law change. And so in our scenario, and so just to set the scene for this particular graph, this graph is not using real numbers. This is not using real data from Tennessee. This graph is just kind of an example to help orient what our actual numbers in later slides will be telling us about this law change. And so in this situation, we have two different groups of students. First, we have a group of students that scored proficient when they took their third grade reading TCAP or 10 Ready test. And second, we have a group of students that was not proficient when they took their third grade reading test. That second group of students that did not score proficient on their reading exams, that is the group of students that is targeted by this law and will be treated by any changes to retention policy that is enacted by this law. And so looking at the blue solid line and the gray dashed line, we might expect that in the absence of any policy changes, these two groups of students would trend similarly over time in their outcomes. But when we introduce this policy change that only affects the students that are not proficient in reading in third grade, we might observe that they would divert their outcomes from their trend as a response to being treated by this law change. And so that difference between the observed trend break and the expected trend in the absence of the treatment is the effect that we're measuring today. And so again, it's not the direct effect of retention, it's not the direct effect of these research-based interventions, it's the effect of this particular group of students now being targeted by this law change starting in the 2012 school year. And so we're able to look at a number of different outcomes, first being later reading achievement. So we're able to follow these students as they move through the later grades and look at their reading assessments through the 8th grade. These reading achievement scores that we'll be sharing today are based around a standardized score. And so we're familiar with like the scale scores that are provided in Tennessee, but just to kind of orient you to what our estimates will look like, we've standardized these scores so that the average is a 0. So anything positive means that there's an increased reading achievement relative to the average, or anything negative would mean that there would be decreased reading achievement relative to the average. We can also look at annual attendance rates, so student level annual attendance rates as they move through later grades, as well as the probability of having a disciplinary record as you move through the later grades. And then our analysis is able to account for differences across schools in retention policy, as well as account for student characteristics that might influence your targeted impact of this policy, such as gender, race, ethnicity, age, economic disadvantage status, English learner status, and disability status. And so what we find is that the retention law had small but positive effects on subsequent reading achievement for that targeted group of students that was performing below proficient on their 3rd grade reading scores. And so what this grade is showing us is, or what this graph is showing us, is that as that treatment group of students, that gray line from the previous example graph, moves through 4th through 8th grade, they're performing better on their reading exams than they would have in the absence of this law change. And so just to kind of outline what we're looking at here, the 0 line would mean that there's no effect of this law change. So any positive coefficient means that students are performing better relative to the mean on their reading scores than they would have. And any number that includes a star next to it means that that is a statistically significant difference from 0. And so we see here that in 4th through 8th grade, there's a statistically significant improvement in reading achievement for that group of students. And so just to put these estimates in context, just because they're random decimals that don't really have any sort of meaning, the achievement gap in this sample between economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged students is about 0.68. And so this 6th grade coefficient of an increase in 0.066 is about 10% of that achievement gap between economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged students. So that's just to kind of put these estimates in context for how much of a gain this is in reading scores. We also find that these students had slightly better disciplinary records after the retention law change. And so a negative coefficient here means that a student is, for example, in 6th grade, 2.2% less likely to receive a disciplinary action in 6th grade after they've been targeted by this retention law change. And so these coefficients, while small, do grow larger as students move into the middle school years, where they're more likely to be subject to disciplinary action. And then we find very small, sometimes significant, but very close to 0 effects on attendance. And so we're not finding that this law change has a particularly pronounced effect on later attendance for these students.
And so we wanted to pause here. We do have a couple of concluding slides, so we're happy to do the concluding slides first, if that's helpful. But we would love to pause here just because this was a pretty intense set of slides around the analysis. And so to see what questions people have about this part of the analysis.
This is Sarah. I'll jump in and ask a dumb question, but just to help us all kind of clarify and digest what you've just shared with us, which thank you. I agree with Nate. It's helpful just to go back through this again in more depth because it is, I think, really important for us to understand now, in particular with the new literacy law and some of the changes that are coming. So if I were to summarize what you all just shared, what you're saying is that if all things had been held equal and these students had not been retained, they potentially wouldn't have seen this small bump in student achievement. Their disciplinary rates would have been slightly worse and attendance sort of a wash. But the positive results are there. It's just they're small.
And the positive results are not the result of retention. They're actually the result of just the law change. So as Caitlin talked about, like, you know, the students, you know, after 2011, when the new law went into effect, right? We have some students who were retained who maybe wouldn't have been retained before, but that wasn't always the case. And so what we're actually showing here is the effect of the law change itself on the students who are targeted by the law. So it's not the effect of retention, it's the effect of the retention law change. And so some districts may have, in fact, some districts did retain more students, but in a lot of districts, it doesn't look like retention necessarily changed, but maybe something else did. And that something else could be partially what's driving these effects that we see.
Got it. So just looking at that snippet of time, essentially, right after the law changed. Yeah.
Yes. And so, and like imagining that something might be different for students, whether it's they're a little bit more likely to be retained or they might be targeted with a different intervention. Maybe more districts are offering summer school or they're offering it to specific students or they're offering, you know, different tiered interventions. So that's kind of how to think about it is like we can't disentangle whether this is the effect of, you know, a particular thing that a particular district is doing. All we can say is that this is the effect of the retention law change on the students who are affected by the law.
Or said another way, this is what we saw happen like immediately preceding or after the law changed in this group of students. Okay, that's helpful.
And that nuance is so critically important in explaining that so everyone understands that, because you said it in the beginning, but hearing it again because of the way that Sarah posed her comments really hit home with me, because obviously, you know, what I have a tendency to say is that I want to know what happened, what was different, what caused the bumps, the improvements. But just knowing what I know, it's highly unlikely that we'll ever have access to that data when you look across the spectrum of all the different schools across the entire state. Capturing that data, I think, would be rather difficult at best. So, but it is helpful to understand that. So thank you for that clarification. And Sarah, for your question to drive to that point. Thank you.
Well, we just have a few more slides. So I think Caitlin will just go through a couple more and then we'll see if we have any kind of concluding questions, thoughts, reflections before we finish up.
So we're also able to look at the strength of these effects in different student subgroups. And so what we find is that the law change had a stronger effect on these outcomes of reading achievement and discipline for economically disadvantaged students, boys, white students, and students without disabilities.
And so I just want to underscore a few points. And I think Sarah, your question like helped that make this point, but I'm just going to make it again here. Is that, you know, in this analysis, we can't capture the effect of retention itself, but we can capture the effect of this law change that's targeting third graders who are not proficient in reading. And then unfortunately, I mean, I think this is absolutely right. You know, we don't know what's happening in terms of individual students' experience with academic interventions. So we can assume that maybe some things are happening or some things are changing, but we just don't know. We don't have the student level information to know what's happening inside schools and districts here. And so just a couple quick summaries and then we'll wrap up. So, you know, as I mentioned, you know, in the February meeting, we really focused on this question of who is retained, how is retention changed over time, and a couple of kind of key points here. One is that over the years of data that we looked at, about 13% of Tennessee students are retained between kindergarten and third grade. And these percentages have been trending down in the last few years. retention rates are higher for economically disadvantaged students, for students with disabilities. And something we didn't show today but have looked at is for students who are relatively young for their cohort, are much more likely to be retained, especially in the early grades. Retention rates do vary across schools and districts, but those rates did not change dramatically, at least during the kind of law and policy changes that have happened over the last 10 years. In terms of the analysis that Caitlin just shared, I think the big takeaways are that the retention law change did have a small positive effect on the students who are targeted by the law. So those are the students who are performing below proficient in reading, but not necessarily only students who are retained, but all students who are below proficient in reading. It had small positive effects on their subsequent reading outcomes in 4th through 8th grade, as well as their likelihood of having a disciplinary record in 4th through 8th grade. Just a couple of kind of brief implications that kind of stem from those conclusions. Certainly, I think the differences across student subgroups is something to think about, and to think about, you know, what do we make of those differences? How is that, you know, how is that happening? What is that? How does that relate to both policy and individual decision making that happens around retention among parents, teachers, and school leaders? I think another really important point is that a lot of students who are targeted by the 3rd grade retention law have already experienced retention, and they're much more likely to have experienced retention if they're in certain student groups. So especially, for example, students with disabilities who are economically disadvantaged, you know, almost 1 in 3 of those students have already experienced retention by the time they get to 3rd grade. So I think that's just something that's important to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about interventions that are tagged to 3rd grade scores or maybe happening earlier. And, you know, people know that, you know, districts are already doing a lot when it comes to reading intervention. So this is not to say that they aren't already doing that, but certainly this policy has been really focused on kind of that 3rd grade threshold. And then finally, you know, we do see these significant but small effects of the law change. And so, you know, how Caitlin and I are interpreting that is that's likely driven by these interventions that are happening, you know, for students who are targeted by the law. And it would be really great to know more about kind of what is actually happening. And so that's certainly something to be, you know, as we're moving forward into this new law, to really be thinking about, you know, are there ways to have a much better sense of how students are experiencing these interventions. So I mentioned before, you know, we have one more research question that we're in the middle of analyzing now. We'll be sharing that in a final memo with the state board in June. We have a little bit of information here about like what will be specifically included in that final set of analyses. But I want to open up the floor in case there are any other additional questions or reflections, or if there are any additional analyses that could be helpful that we could work on as we're kind of completing this project.
I have a question with the, you know, such a higher percentage of students with disabilities and retention. Since those are classified as students with disabilities, they all have IEPs. What are the effects of what is allowable for retention / promotion as outlined through the modifications, accommodations within IEP affect that? So it would just seem that there shouldn't be that high of a percentage when these students have, and these are legal documents that determine what they get in their education with very precise goals and monitoring and checkbacks to parents and all of those things. So how is that occur? You may not know, how is that happening when these students all have IEPs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I do think like school-based or district-based folks would probably be in a better position to answer like what's actually happening in those meetings where this decision's being made. You know, we did talk with a colleague of ours who's in special education, and she said that we were surprised by these differences for students with disabilities, and she was not. She thought that this reflected what she has seen in other states and research on retention of students with disabilities. And so that doesn't really answer your question, but I do think, you know, it's certainly the evidence would suggest that these students are getting retained at higher rates. And so certainly something is happening here where, you know, the decisions that are being made, you know, in an IEP meeting or at the school level. Retention is clearly being seen as kind of part of the plan for those students, or at least for some of those students.
And so since we're looking at policy, greater clarity of what is allowable within students with disabilities and not would be something as a consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and absolutely, like trying to better understand what is happening would be
Oh.
very useful too.
Thanks, Jack. Doesn't make me feel better, but I appreciate the clarity. Shall not retain students based on disability. And yet there's a higher percentage. Okay. Jack just sent a message to everyone and just said the new retention law states that LEAs in public charter schools shall not retain a student based on the student's disability or suspected disability. So one would think then those percentages would have more alignment as opposed to such disparate
Well, then
percentage.
it will be interesting to see the effect after this new law is when it's in effect.
Yeah,
Those percentages go down as a result of the changes in the law.
right.
I'll be interested to see that too. Thank you.
So, thank you, Jack. Other questions?
This is Warren. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Good. Okay. I tried to talk in earlier and it wasn't working. So this is my first time seeing this. I'm new to the committee and the board. So I guess the thing that I was most surprised about was that retention doesn't seem to help or have a negative effect. As someone who's new to this, that was interesting. And I guess my question is, can you help me understand how you know? So we saw a small bump to this population after that change. It's so small, and you don't know what was done. Was it intervention or retention? So how do we know it wasn't something else in the environment that caused that bump, or another law, or something like that? What makes y'all feel comfortable where this is it?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And so we've thought about this in a couple different ways. So, you know, it is to be able to pick it up, it would have to be something that would only affect students who are not proficient in reading. And it would have to only affect students after that threshold of when the law went into effect. And so, as you all know, there's tons of, you know, Tennessee has been, you know, so active when it comes to, you know, new programs and policies. And so, you know, there is a lot going on across this period of time. What we have done is, like, sometimes we'll do the analysis where we look like at a smaller group of students. So for example, in this analysis, we're looking 2 years before the law change happens and 3 years after the law change happens. We do an analysis where we look just at the years before and after, and we see similar results. We've also done that with a couple of other ways where we can kind of focus in on a narrower group of students and we see kind of similar patterns. Now, it's still possible that there is something else that we're picking up on here. And so, you know, if anyone is like, oh, well, I think it was, you know, this was going on at exactly that time, like we would love to hear that, because we could kind of try to see, you know, whether we can suss out in the data, you know, whether that could be part of what we're finding here.
Thanks.
This is Daryl. Just one question. With this information, of course, I know you're sharing it with the state board. Are there other legislative or educational body organizations you're sharing it with as well?
Yeah, so we're, you know, we'll be doing both a memo for the state board. We'll do a public version of that as well that Tara will put out over the summer likely. And so then we'll disseminate that, you know, through all the different channels that Tara uses to get research out. And then Caitlin and I are also working on a paper that's for a more academic audience. So like other researchers who study retention policies. And so we'll be doing a couple different ways to try to get kind of our findings out there in the world.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, I am so thankful for both of you coming and spending and again, amazingly sharing with us all of this data and truly taking the time to consider what implications this has. I think, we just listened to Clarksville Montgomery talk about the importance of the data, the story that it tells. And I think what you guys are doing is putting together and doing the work of helping us find data on and how what we do at a policy level can affect student learning and also, dispelling myths and finding out new things along the way. And so thank you so much. Just like she says at the end of her slide here, they're going to do a final memo that we shared with all the board members in June. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so next up, we're going to, I'm going to introduce our Department of Education. They're going to share with us their Winter Universal Screening. A lot of a mouthful. Let me say that again. They're going to share with us their Winter Universal Reading Screener data. So just as you guys come up from the department, just name and title so we have it for the record. And then once you guys go through that, we will open it up to the floor to members for questions.
Sure, Lisa Coons, Chief Academic Officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. I'm going to present the slide, but Jack is also on the call to field questions. Rachel Ross, my Senior Director of Early Literacy Strategy, and Jennifer Jordan, who's the Assistant Commissioner of Special Education Programming and Intervention Programming. So this was a team effort. This was certainly a new endeavor, and I'm going to talk through that a little bit, but I'm excited to kind of spearhead the presentation. But the team will definitely be available to answer some of the technical questions if there are any and about where we are. So excited to be in that space. Am I going to be sharing my screen or is someone else going to be sharing the deck? I wasn't sure, Jack. I know we had talked.
Lisa, you should be able to move the slides forward, I believe.
Yeah, if you have presenter mode, it should have let's see.
There should be arrows at the top above the slides or on the left-hand side. There you go.
Sorry. We live in Microsoft Teams, so I had to switch gear. Sorry, y'all. Okay, so as y'all know, the strategic plan for the department has academics at the top, and all Tennessee's students will have access to a high-quality education by learning to read and reading to learn with high-quality materials. And I think this universal reading screening data really equips us to think about this part of our strategic plan. It is about learning to read and making sure we know at the very beginning of their school careers how they're learning to read, whether they're on track, whether they're not on track. So excited that we finally have been talking about universal reading screening data for quite some time, that we are standardizing that approach and that we do have access to that very important data so we can think intentionally about the programming and the supports that we provide districts around learning to read. And really want to talk through, we've talked several times at the subcommittee about the differences in data and the importance of data, but we know that literacy is the key to access and opportunity in life, and the ability to read complex texts open doors in higher education, but all across the professional fields. We know it changes their trajectory and their career options, and we know it actually changes their socioeconomic status and their social emotional health in their lifelong goals. So it is critical for us to think about literacy, and we can't think about literacy without intentionally thinking about reading and all of the components of reading. So I'm going to get a little sciencey for a minute and talk about what we talk about in the literacy world and what we talk about our little kiddos when they come into kindergarten, what we're really focusing on when we think about reading. It is a complex process. We use this Scarborough's rope research to talk about the components of reading and how many different strands of components go into reading. So when we talk about the reading and the universal reading screener, there are multiple assessments that measure a different component of this strand of rope. And the universal reading screener helps us understand which pieces of the rope are developing into that skilled reading and where there are gaps. So we love talking about the Scarborough's rope. It's part of that early reading training and that science of reading training that Clarksville Montgomery talked about earlier. But this is a great visual representation of what we're really trying to look at when we look at universal reading screening data. We are actually teasing apart those strands and watching those strands as they develop to make sure that a student is progressing in their reading skills. This is a graphic that I borrowed from that early reading course so that we all have consistent models of what that reading should look like. So when we think about the different measures that we talk about at the State Department, we now have this universal reading screening process, and we also have the TCAP process. And we talked about this a great deal back in our earlier literacy subcommittee about the differences between TCAP and universal reading. So what we're really looking at universal reading screening data is we're looking at those early reading capacity. We're looking at whether or not print concepts, understanding print, that phonological awareness, that sounds, can I hear the sounds in the words, that phonics, do those sounds go to letters, letters go to words, and then are those words becoming automatic and fluent? And then as a student develops all of these things, that fluency and that automaticity allows a student to begin to comprehend text. And when we merge that understanding, that meaning of text, that is when a student starts applying those literacy skills that are measured in TCAP. TCAP measures whether or not a student has that rope all pulled together. Then it measures whether or not the student can read, comprehend, and apply that comprehension to a task. It measures whether or not a student can express that understanding through written expression and put those conventions together. So the TCAP really, starting in 3rd grade, starts to measure that rope all together and that application of the ability to do that. What we're trying to do in universal reading screening and the data that I'm going to show you in a minute is about measuring these components, these early components, and how a student is developing. When we talk about measures in universal reading screening, we use a totally different set of language. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that language to set up the data reports that we're going to share. So as a reminder, the Universal Reading Screener started August 2nd, which was just about a week after we passed the rule, and you passed the rule, and I supported you in passing the rule in the State Board approved Universal Reading Screeners. So it was just a very quick turnaround. It was a very fast uptick for our districts to go from these are my options to this is my start date. So our districts had their fall window between August 2nd and October 1st. Obviously, there were lots of learning experiences in that first opportunity to collect data from 7 different universal reading screeners, and it was important to us that that data was attached to that student identifiers so we can think about the different types of students and how their reading is developing, and that student identifier is also attached to that teacher and that school identifier so we can look at different regions and different schools and the different supports that the schools are doing and receiving so we can understand better what models are working. So fall was a learning experience for sure. We collected data. We learned how to collect that data well. We learned how to really make sure that data was in place. And it took a great deal of time, probably till December, till we were making sure those student ID numbers and those teacher ID numbers and all of those ID numbers came together. So excited to have clean fall data now, and winter went much more smoothly for us, and we were able to take those fall and winter data. So that's what you're going to look at are the fall and winter data resources. We calculate data in 4 different areas. First, we calculate in reading readiness. Those are those early phonological awareness phonics skills in K1. We calculate comprehension as students start to build that fluency and comprehension in 2-3. And then we measure fluency K3 across all grade levels because we want to understand how that fluency is building and how it's interacting. And then there's a composite, and that composite really is about how that entire rope is being built together. So we build those and measure those 4 different areas to understand all of those pieces and how they are developing in each of those grade levels. When we think about reading readiness, when we think about composite, when we think about fluency and comprehension, there are different measures inside the Universal Reading Screener package that are built together to create a score. And those scores are normative, and that's very different than the way in which we measure proficiency and cut scores in our TCAP world. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have a normative score. So when we think about proficiency and we think about the TCAP, A cut score means this is where a student's proficient or not. So if a student has a score on their TCAP, a scale score of 40, and the cut score is say a 50, that cut score says they're not proficient. And it's about meeting that cut on that assessment. So I have a certain number of questions, I have a certain number of components that I have to score correctly to meet that proficiency level. So when we think about a criterion reference test, which is what our TCAP is, it's not how I perform in relation to my peers. It's how I perform in that static measure and whether I make it or not. So whether I finish the race, whether I get two-thirds of the way through the race or not quite very far, it's finishing the race. And it's a little bit different in the criterion reference when we talk about TCAP scores. So I just wanted to preview that a bit before we move into what we're going to talk about when we talk about universal reading screening. So when we think about universal reading screening, it is actually a norm reference test. And we take this lovely young lady in her red polka dotted shirt and we compare her performance in comparison to her peers. So when we take all of the peers who are taking that universal reading screener, and this was one of the components that we talked about when we met in July to say whether or not a universal reading screener had the components we needed. One of those components is a norm reference because we need to make sure she is developing in concert with her peers. So how is her performance in relation to everyone else as they develop reading? When we think about all those strands in the reading rope, it's not cut score, cut score, cut score. It's a developmental approach. So this is very different in the way we measure developmental reading and how we measure a student's progress in universal reading screening than we measure have they met that end of the race component when they're applying those skills and those standards to show their literacy. So when we think of norm referenced, if a student scores a 40, that might be the 38th percentile. And when we think about the 38th percentile, if you lined 100 students up, that 38 would be where the student's spot in line was in comparison to their peers. So we're going to look at the data in one slide. Don't worry, I'm getting there, but want to talk a little bit about the difference in the data you're going to see in TCAP versus the data you're going to see in universal reading screening. I'm going to pause there before we get into the data to make sure everybody's comfortable with what we're talking about when we talk about norm scores. Okay. So this is the moment. This is the moment I've been waiting for. I'm super excited to share this data. This is our winter screening data. So when we look at our winter screening data and we average the norm across the state, our norm is in the 41st percentile. And this is matched to our nationally norm percentile. And I will mention these nationally norm percentiles were pre-COVID. So they were pre-normed and lined up before the national norms before our COVID. So the average of where students were performing pre-COVID was between the 40th and 59th percentile, which is a big deal because it means our kiddos post-COVID this year on their scores are scoring in the 41st percentile. So they are moving in the same step of their peers. And we are excited to see that. And when we look at first grade, we're a little bit below that norm percentile, which makes sense because they had that gap year. But what is most exciting to us as we look at this preliminary early data is when we see second and third grade moving in the 44th percentile and the 45th percentile. When we think back to that reading report that I gave you earlier in the fall about where we were with achievement in our second and third graders and how concerned we were to see with our second graders to see them then show in their screening that this pickup in the 45th percentile, we are hopeful that this will translate also to their TCAP. So we're really excited that our average composites, when we think about that whole measurement of that rope, that we are seeing all of our student groups in line with the average performance. Our state average performance is within the national average performance that was measured pre-COVID. So as we look at our students and their development of reading and look at their national norm, so where they are in comparison and that range of that norm, that regular range where we want them to be is between 40 and 59, they are walking in that range that was set prior to COVID. So this is just winter screening data, and it's just looking at that composite. So I'm going to pause for a second, see if there's any questions there, and then I'm going to walk through growth data and what we're seeing between fall and winter, and talking through a little bit more of a dig down into the fall to winter data.
Lisa, this is Warren. Help me understand, why is the national average so big, 40 to 59?
Yeah, it's like a bell curve. So
Okay.
when we think of a bell curve and that standardized middle, and then the 1 deviation, 2 deviation, the middle of that bell curve is where most students should fall. And that is why that range is so large for the norm in the middle. It's very different than when we look at cut scores for proficiency. But great question. Any other questions? Okay. When we start to look at this data in a more specific way, and we look at where our students were in fall and where they are in winter, I think, Warren, this is where it starts to become more helpful in looking at comparison data. So where we were in the fall, you can see that red line in kindergarten, first, second, and third. Obviously, we would like that first grade line to be up a little higher, but it gives us a sense that our first graders are not quite as matched with their peers. But we are seeing that faster trajectory in second grade. So we are seeing that jump from where they were in comparison to their peers in the fall versus where they are in their comparison in the winter.
Lisa, when do we expect to see the results of the third?
Yep. So I'm going to go back to that slide real quickly. We are collecting that data right now. They are giving that assessment through May 20th. It is a much tighter collection window between when they collect and when they have to report their data. I would expect that we will have most of them by May 27th, but we will probably have to do a little bit of cleanup to make sure that they're all in there. The data collection, once it is clean, is a very fast process now that we've normed on all those processes. So I would say probably mid to late June, we would be able to say fall to spring and what we're seeing. And we can also start looking at this data in comparison to TCAP and look at what the norm reference and the development of the rope is telling us in comparison to that criterion reference, which was our hope, right? Like, this is about the development of reading, and it's going to tell us whether we are on track and where we're on track. And then when we start to compare that with TCAP, it's very helpful. And when we start to tease out these specific reading readiness, composite, comprehension, and fluency between fall and spring, we'll really start to see great data. So this is early data. This is early predictive data. It's not going to give us any, yes, we're there kind of moments. It is early data.
Thank you for that, because it is exciting to see the improvement from the fall to the winter. So I know we're all excited to see the spring results. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, very excited. So then when we dig in and we actually look at our kindergarten data, you're going to see that reading readiness, which is what we want our kindergartners to focus on, right? That's that early part of the rope. That's the sounds to letters, that phonological phonics kind of component. You're going to see that move very quickly. That is good data for us, because it says we were at 36 at the beginning of the year, which is where we should be, because we're a bit behind after the past 2 years and just the opportunities of pre-K and those kinds of things that our children had. But to see that growth throughout the year, that's a positive thing. And then fluency should be a little bit more flat, because that's a more complex skill along the rope in kindergarten. So this data is promising as well in our kindergarten space, and really excited to see that reading readiness move so quickly. What we are excited to see, again, this is early data, is when the Reading Research Center starts really digging in over time and watching these components in comparison with those great teachers that you saw in Clarksville and what kinds of strategies and supports they're receiving, and then looking at the student results and combining those together. I think that will be when we can really start digging in and looking at some exciting components. And then when we look at first grade, Jennifer tells me not to worry about this data, and that's why she's on this call. This is where I get a little stressed out, because I want to see all the lines going up, and I want to continue to see that. but she will tell you, and the experts will tell you, that as students focus more on fluency, those isolated sounds and letters, they're not going to score as well in those isolated sounds and letters because they're focusing on putting it together and reading more fluently. So as their automaticity increases, they stop hearing all those individual sounds and those pieces. So she says this is good data. I will trust her because she is definitely the expert and she definitely has the expertise in this. But we'll definitely be looking closely at first grade. You saw the little dip in the overall line in kindergarten, first, second, and third. I would say this is where our data is not quite where we want it to be. It's not quite in a fast uptick in those norms as much as we would like to see. And given that these students had pre-K in 1920, kindergarten in 2021, and those are absolutely pivotal years in that reading readiness, I would not be surprised with what the contextual experience of this data is as we look at first grade. And really, that's why we need to have this data, because it helps us know that we really did need to dig in with our first and second graders to make sure that that sounds first and that reading readiness is reinforced as much as possible. And then when we look at second grade, this is very strong data. You're going to expect some fluency flatline as students start to put comprehension together. That means the text is getting harder, the reading levels are getting harder, the vocabulary is getting more complex in second grade. We're starting to put that rope together and we're starting to expect those things. Because remember, fluency and comprehension is our K2. Third grade's really where we're going to start measuring TCAP and literacy. So we want to see that high level of comprehension growth and see that move into that space, that national average space. As we talked about, that national average is 40 to 59. We were not in that national average space. We were down in the tail of the curve at the fall. We are well into that higher end of that national norm as we look at towards winter. So it'll be very exciting, Lillian, to look at that spring and see if that continues and that continues all the way through. Because I would say that spring in second grade is really where that text is going to start to get much harder, and see if they can maintain this growth. And then, and as you can see in third grade, that's where that text is really starting to get complex. So you're going to see that line move more slowly. So this is another area where, you know, we have to keep watching and making sure that the fluency continues and the comprehension continue at an upward tick. So exciting that we are actually moving into the ranges of pre-COVID and moving into those norms, but want to make sure we're continuing to follow this data, connect the normative data to that criterion reference data of TCAP and to the spring data, and make sure that we are continuing to see this early data. And as you said, Lillian, the possible excitement of this data, I certainly don't want to overinflate this data in any way, but the possibility that this data could bring for us and really help us dig in. Obviously, this is first year data. First year data is we're not going to be able to have clean enough data to make sure we're looking at student groups, we're looking at different demographics, and some of the things that you saw in the earlier presentation. But as we move into next year, we will be able to disaggregate this pretty specifically and look at our socioeconomic students, our different demographics of our students with disabilities, and really dig into this data and be able to have a much more complex picture. So early data, starting to see good things, but we really are excited about digging into this data more and more deeply to see where those trends are and better understand that. So we're hoping to get a lot more specific as we move into spring and into June. I do have Jennifer's name on here because technical questions should definitely be answered, like the calculations and things by Jennifer, and she is on the call if we need her to step in, but happy to answer the overarching questions and the things we're really excited about and hopeful about in the potential of this data.
Any questions based on universal screen report from winter? I would just say, you know, I think when you look in light of where we've been the last 24 months, the I think the pace by which things have come at everybody, and the changes that have come at everybody, and just the conditions for doing education, let alone documenting, reporting, benchmarking, and all of those things. This is encouraging. Like Lillian said, I think it creates a hopeful picture based on, especially like you said, where we were in the fall. Um, and yet, I love the idea that yes, this is exciting and hopeful, and we're still going. And I think it's just a credit to the people in the schools that are really, again, have pivoted quick, have moved around, have redone things, including our Department of Education doing that as well. And so I just want to say thank you for this, and thank you for the great work that you guys are doing in something very new, and yet willing to dig in and say, you know, here's where we are. Some areas we're really excited about, some I'm nervous about, but they tell me it's okay, and all of those things. So I just want to say thank you. And if and does anyone else have any questions before we move on in our agenda? Okay, so thank you. We really appreciate, Lisa, everything you've just shared with us, and look forward to I mean, this is going to be kind of a constant conversation, I'm sure, um, as we go along. And so want to just transition now into another department report on our literacy landscape analysis. Um, and Lisa, I think that's you again. So I'm just talking to give you a time to get a drink of water if you need one. Um, all right, we will jump right into our landscape for literacy.
I will just say that I am going to do 140 pages in 14 minutes. UTK delivered 70 pages on K-12 and 70 pages on ed prep providers. So I will do my best to go fast and high, but the dig in the level of detail that UTK provided in the detailed landscape analysis is definitely worth its read. So I will promise you that this will be a very high level, but definitely want you to dig into the actual reports that UTK provided, because there's some really interesting correlations to some of our earlier data that we have shared. So as you know, the strategic plan and really the Literacy Success Act required the department to procure a K-12 literacy landscape analysis, and that was really looking at last year, what were our current practices, our student achievement, our instructional programming for students, and our remediation services. I will define remediation as our RTI squared. That is the data they looked at for the K-12 analysis. So it is really about what were the current practices in K-12, what is the student achievement, what instructional programming for students do they experience, and what are the interventions that we provide for students. And then they also did the landscape analysis for literacy instruction, which included the instructional programming that our aspiring educators get, the pedagogical practices used by our education providers. So this report will take a floor. The goal of this report was to do what is going on in Tennessee before we really dig into the Tennessee Literacy Success Act. So this is where we started. It's exciting to have UTK as winning this grant award for both places, because they are also our reading research center. So now they can take these baseline reports and start to incorporate universal reading screening data, how many teachers are taking reading courses, and compare that to scores, and really start to dig in and put the data together. And this is the floor for those opportunities with the Reading Research Center. So very excited to move into that space after we move forward with the literacy landscape analysis. So as a qualifier, this is the data that they used to do the K-12 literacy landscape. They did focus on grades 3-5. We didn't have universal reading screener at the time. We will moving forward from 2017 to 2021. They also looked at instructional practices and programming across grades K-5. That was really collected from the foundational literacy skills plans and the data that the districts provided by June 1st last year. So the districts were required as part of the Tennessee Literacy Success Act to give us a lot of data about their K-5 ELA instruction, their intervention, their programming, and their resources. UTK used a lot of that in their analysis of where we are K-12 in the state. And then there is a specific focus on literacy remediation services. I would call this our RTI programming across the state, because they used our RTI data, our progress monitoring data, and the programming that was used in the analysis. When we look at the analysis, the grade 3 and grade 3 through 5 data, I have presented that to you. It's identical to what we talked about in the fall. We dropped between 2019 to 2021. We dropped 4 percentage points. We dropped 5 percentage points in grades 3 through 5. So we know that in between our pandemic kind of windows, we did drop quite a bit in our early grades literacy. And then we also showed that as we dropped, we had bigger gaps in our student groups. And we talked about that within the state report. It is also in UTK's report around performance. So the data matches, it is concerning, and why we need to really start digging in from last year in the work that we have really started to focus on this year. What was interesting to us, some of the additional data calculations, is they looked at the data by region, they looked at the data by different types of districts, and they did not see variances or distinction between regions across the state or types of districts. They only had 10 districts show an increase in the number of third grade students on track or mastered. So that was additional data that they provided to us around performance. As we move into instructional practice and programming, this was my favorite part of the report. I'm just going to be super subjective on this page. And they noted that the K2 foundational skills instruction, that is the part of that rope that really talks about phonics, and it talks about sounds first. We have 92 districts spending 60 or more minutes on foundational skills in the state. We have 19 districts and charters spending 60 to 90 minutes, and we have 11 districts spending 90 to 120 minutes a day on foundational skills. So that was based on their foundational literacy skills plan. Obviously, that's self-reported, but they went through some pretty rigorous feedback loops for final plans. So that's exciting that students are getting that much of their instructional day really focused on those beginning reading, those fluency and comprehension pieces in their daily instruction. It was also pretty exciting to see that students were spending at least 30 minutes a day in 78% of the schools in the state on foundational skills in grades 3-5. And that means we're really continuing that work on sounds. We're continuing that work on comprehension. We're making sure that students have that as their text gets more complex. And so that was a real signal that the time and structures in the day are there for students to receive appropriate instruction. And that was during the 2021 school year. So that was exciting to see in the report. The other piece that was interesting to us is the most common supplement of materials around foundational skills is the department's free foundational literacy skills supplement. Last year we had 20%, about 1 in 5 of our districts and charters report that they were supplementing their curriculum with the Tennessee foundational skills, and that sounds first set of materials that are available for free and at no cost to districts to really dig in addition to their programming. I would say that number would probably be a little bit higher as we move into this year, and that real strong focus on high quality materials definitely for foundational skills was in the report. Now, this is the section on RTI squared. Obviously, 100% of our LEAs are using an approved universal reading screener and providing plans for assessment and programming using the results. I will say this is June 1st. This was before the July 23rd suite of state board approved screeners. So this was prior to that policy that y'all passed. And then 31% reported that they plan to use the Tennessee Universal Reading Screener in that space in June 1st. What we did see is that for Tier 3, they were using 30 to 60 minutes on specific areas of deficit for students. However, over 75 different materials were reported. So where we have 10 approved materials for Tier 1 instruction and core instruction and their ELA, there is a wide variance of what we're doing in intervention for reading and a wide variance of small group, individualized. So when we look at down into those tiers of intervention and that intervention every day, the landscape said we're all over the place. What we're doing varies quite a bit in our schools and in our districts around what we're doing for intervention. I'm going to pause there because that is where we are with K-12 districts. and want to make sure that if there are any fast questions, I can answer those. Okay. When we think about the EPP landscape analysis, UTK looked at a couple of key items as they were working through their process. They looked at faculty participation in the Course 1 and Course 2 early reading trainings. As some of you may be aware, and maybe not everyone, we encouraged all the EPP faculty across the state to go to the early reading training, the Reading 360 training that Clarksville Montgomery mentioned earlier. Was available to our EPP faculty as well. So those faculty members who are teaching our aspiring teachers were able to go to the reading training. And so part of the landscape analysis, and you'll see this very detailed in the report, how many professors went, what their experiences were, what they thought, and some feedback on their experiences through that training to make sure all of our knowledge levels across the state are similar. And then our education prep providers reporting on their courses that they devote to early literacy, on the instructional time that they devote to early literacy. So what are the structures in the education preparation provider space that focus on early literacy? And then last, what are the instructional programming and pedagogical practices used in the provider space to prepare teachers to teach foundational skills? They looked at 3 program areas specifically: early childhood, elementary ed, and special education. So I'm going to wing through these graphs, but really encourage you to look deeply. What they have broken apart are who were the early childhood professors, who were the elementary ed professors, who were the special ed professors who attended Course 1. Again, that's that asynchronous week, who attended Course 2. And then some of their anecdotal responses across the state on what they felt like in the Course 1 training. And remember, Course 1 is that science of reading. Course 2 is that application to classroom and application to foundational skills. And then the second part, this is the structures. So what courses are available in different spaces in the early childhood across the state, what credits are available, how they structure that in their actual division into reading comprehension, into literacy development, into that application component. So there's a good analysis across the state of what our EPPs were doing last year. And then last but not least, there's an analysis of what are the pedagogical principles of instruction and expectations of practices prior to the rollout of the new standards that were passed in the summer. So this is prior to summer. You can see the science of reading, the structured literacy, culturally responsive teaching. You can also see some things in the elementary education that are different from the standards that were adopted and approved in July in our landscape analysis in that space. And also you see some of the practices that they're focusing on. So just want to call out that this is prior to the change in standards. It gives us a really good sense of where our prep providers were focusing in literacy and what kinds of components of literacy they were teaching. And so very quickly, in about 30 seconds, I'm going to tell you that we have lots of LEAs and lots of public charters with structures for foundational skills instruction. They are supplementing those materials with current foundational skill resources to really get that at that phonological awareness component. That the one that is used most is our supplement. And then the variants, again, that we talked about around intervention. That 3-5 foundational skills, I would say, I would love to see a national analysis and compare that nationally for you, because it would be interesting to me to see what nationally districts across the country are doing around foundational skills in grade 3-5. I'm in particularly proud that we're still focusing on that as students go into higher grades. And then you can see the participation, the science of reading, and the materials that were not apparent in the study, and digging into the materials and the ed prep provider is a focus that UTK is interested in. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take any questions that you might have to make sure to give you time to soak. I know we had 12 minutes on 140 pages of research from UTK. So that was the very fast Maserati version of summary of the reports.
Anyone?
I did see where Jack offered to send us the entire report.
Yes, I'm going to follow up and give you all the PDF versions of these. They are, in certain points, appropriately steeped in research language, but I think paired with this slide deck that Dr. Coons has created with the takeaways and the reports, it's a lot of really informative and useful information. And we're more than happy to schedule follow-up calls to help kind of walk through or provide further clarity about any of it.
And I would really be happy to come back. We've been working with the Research Center to think about the research questions that this kind of provides and helps us think about next steps and where we are thinking we want to start digging into all of these data points that we now have now versus last year and how we start putting together and thinking about reading in the state. So I'm happy to come back and kind of give you an update from that perspective on the Reading Research Center and where we're going with all of this work.
And Lisa, I'm glad you said that because with the 360 Reading Literacy Council that I have the opportunity to serve on, I think there's so many data points and rich information that is shared through that council. I think at some point in time it would be very beneficial for this particular literacy study group committee to have more of that information shared with them. And they wouldn't even really know about it unless I said something or you said something. But I think it would be certainly better position coming from you. And to take, how many pages did you say? 156 pages?
A lot.
and tear it down to provide us something that's more easily digested, if you will, is appreciated. And so I know it would be challenging for all of us with everything else we have going on to be able to dig through a much larger report. So I personally thank you for that. But I think there are some things from the future from the 360 Literacy Council would be beneficial too. So thank you.
Yep. And I know you're sharing bright spots of districts. We have 5 state model districts. So if you ever need great superintendents and district leaders to talk about some of the model work, that I'm happy to share that as well. I'm really proud of those districts.
I would love that. Yeah, please send those to me, to us.
Yep, happy to.
Be great. Okay, so are there any other questions or discussions or anything we need to go over for final discussion? Hearing none, I want to again thank all of our presenters today from Clarksville, from the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, from our Department of Education. And it's just, I mean, again, we couldn't fit it in 2 hours really. And yet it was so good and such good information, which also I think highlights the amount of work that's going into education in the state of Tennessee, specifically in this case, literacy. And I love to hear all of these real examples of how everybody is working in the same direction towards kids reading, because we know how important it is. We know it's crucial to the success and development of a citizenry of Tennessee. And so I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the State Board of Education and the State Board staff to all of you who presented. It was such good information. And so if that is all, then I'm supposed to say to end our meeting without objection, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you for being our leader. Sharing. Thank you so much.
I'm learning. I'm learning from you.
You're doing a great job.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.